Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analysing the Hindu newspaper dated 15th of May 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears as an editorial on page number 8. The title of the article is Missing Demand. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Economy, under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. Before analysing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Now you all must be aware the Central Statistical Organization, which is working under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, comes out with the estimates related to the gross domestic product. So if you look at the quarterly estimates of the Central Statistical Organization, in the financial year 2018, the GDP growth rate increased from 6% to around 8%. However, what is the worrying factor here is that in the financial year 2019, the GDP growth rate has declined every quarter, wherein at the first quarter of the financial year 2019, the GDP rate was around 8%. However, it has now declined to around 6%. Apart from the slowdown in the GDP growth rate, there has been contraction even in the index of industrial production as well. Now, the index of industrial production measures the changes in the volume of production of goods within a country, and ideally, the index of industrial production should be in the positive category. That means to say a positive IIP would denote that there is expansion in the production of industrial goods. However, if you look at the IIP for the month of March, the IIP has now got reduced to minus 0.1%, which means to say that there is contraction in the production of industrial goods. So if you look at the trends in the index of industrial production, the IIP, which was at around 4.5% at the start of the financial year 2018, has now dropped down to around minus 0.1%. Further, with respect to measurement of IIP, it takes into account both the sector-based classification as well as the goods-based classification. With respect to sector-based classification, it mainly takes into account manufacturing, mining and electricity with the highest weightage to the manufacturing sector. With respect to goods-based classification, it takes into account mainly 6 categories of goods. Now these categories of goods are intermediate goods, infrastructure goods, primary goods, capital goods, consumer durables and consumer non-durables. Now if you want to remember the various categories of goods which are covered under the IIP, you can simply remember the acronym IIP-CCC, wherein IIP here would correspond to both IIP as well as the intermediate, infrastructure and primary, whereas the CCC would correspond to the capital goods, consumer durables and consumer non-durables. Now with respect to the performance of the index of industrial production in March 2019, there has been contraction in both capital goods as well as the consumer durables, wherein the growth of capital goods was around minus 8.7% and the growth of consumer durables was minus 5.1%. Apart from these two government estimates put forth by the Central Statistical Organization and the Index of Industrial Production, according to the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, there has been drastic decline in the sales of the different categories of vehicles in India. Now all these facts and figures clearly highlight that the Indian economy as such is showing a signs of economic slowdown. In this regard, this editorial here tries to analyze various reasons with respect to the growing economic slowdown with respect to the Indian economy. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand the main reasons with respect to the signs of economic slowdown of the Indian economy. Before understanding the reasons for the economic slowdown in India, let us first understand as to how the GDP is calculated. Now you all must be aware the GDP is calculated by using mainly 3 different methods. Now these 3 methods are the production method, the income method and the expenditure method. Now under the expenditure method, what essentially we do here is that we add up the expenditure of the individuals, households, corporate entities as well as the government rated expenditure. So if you look at the formula for GDP, according to the expenditure method, it is denoted as C plus I plus G plus X minus M, wherein C denotes for the consumption expenditure, which essentially relates to the expenditure incurred by the individuals and the households. Secondly, I stands for the investment expenditure, which essentially refers to the expenditure incurred by the corporate entities on the creation of new assets. G refers to the government expenditure, X refers to the exports, and M refers to the imports. So if you look at the value, that is X minus M, it refers to the net value of exports from India. So by adding all these factors, we arrive at the GDP according to the expenditure method. So if one looks at these four components of the GDP calculation, the consumption expenditure is considered to be the leading contributor to the India's GDP, wherein the consumption expenditure accounts for approximately around 60% of India's GDP. And this consumption expenditure is in turn dependent upon the demand for goods and services. That means to say, if there is a higher demand for goods and services, automatically the consumption expenditure would also increase. Alternatively, if there is lower demand for goods and services, then there would be a decline in the consumption expenditure. Now, with respect to demand for goods and services in a country, there are a number of factors which determine the demand for goods and services. Now, some of the factors which determine the demand for goods and services in a country include the employment level in a country. That is, if more number of people are employed, there would be a higher demand for goods, and accordingly the consumption expenditure would also increase. Alternatively, if less number of people are employed, then there would be a lower demand for goods, leading to a decline in the consumption expenditure. The second determining factor can be the money supply. So higher the money supply, higher would be the demand and higher would be the consumption expenditure. Alternatively, a decline in the money supply or a liquidity crunch would lead to a reduced demand, leading to the decline in the consumption expenditure. Further, the demand for goods and services is also dependent upon the rate of interest on the loans, wherein lower rate of interest leads to an increase in the consumption expenditure, whereas an increase in the rate of interest on the loans leads to a decrease in the consumption expenditure. Now, what has happened in case of India is that the consumption expenditure, which is a leading contributor to India's GDP, has been facing a slowdown. So this particular decline in the consumption expenditure is in turn leading to the decline in the GDP growth rate. So one of the main reasons for the economic slowdown has been attributed to the decline in the consumption expenditure, which in turn can be linked to the decline in the demand for the goods and services. Thus, in this regard, let us understand the reasons for the decline in the consumption expenditure in India. Now, the first reason with respect to the decline in the consumption expenditure can be attributed to the agrarian distress. Presently, around 68% of India's population presently live in the rural areas, and they in turn contribute significantly to the consumption expenditure. However, what has been happening in the recent times is that the agriculture sector as such is facing the agrarian distress, wherein the farmers are not being able to realize the fair and remunerative prices on the food grains which they grow, and this has in turn led to a decline in the farm incomes, leading to the decline in their disposable income and consequently a lower demand for goods and services in the Indian economy. The second reason with respect to the decline in the consumption expenditure is the decline in the employment growth rate. Now, even though Indian economy is considered to be one of the fastest growing economy, however, the main problem with respect to Indian economy here is that the rate of growth in India is considered to be a jobless growth. That means to say, even though the Indian economy is growing, it is not being able to create sufficient amount of jobs. So if people do not have jobs, this would ultimately lead to the decline in the demand for goods and services. Now, with respect to decline in the employment growth rate, various agencies in the recent past have highlighted this particular facts and figures. For example, according to the recent periodic labor force survey report, the unemployment rate in India stands at almost 6%, which is considered to be the highest in the last 45 years. Apart from this particular report, if one looks at the employment elasticity in India, it is hardly around 0.2%. Now, this employment elasticity essentially refers to the percentage change in the employment with 1% change in the GDP. So, the employment elasticity actually measures the ability of the economy to create jobs with an increase in its size. And ideally, with 1% change in the GDP, there should be 1% change in the employment. In other words, the employment creation in an economy should be commensurate with the changes in the GDP. However, if you look at the employment elasticity in case of India, it is hardly around 0.2%, which means to say with 1% change in India's GDP, the change in the employment is hardly around 0.2%. That is why it is being said that the Indian economy is not being able to create sufficient amount of jobs, which is in turn denoted as the jobless growth. Now coming to the third reason for the decline in the consumption expenditure, it can be attributed to the present liquidity crunch in the Indian economy. This is because the banks in India, particularly the public sector banks, have accumulated a higher amount of non-performing assets. So due to this higher NPAs, the amount of credit creation, that is the amount of loans given by the banks, have also reduced commensurately. And this has in turn led to a decrease in the demand for the goods and services. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is Facing the Climate Emergency. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Environment, under the subsection Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation. Now, before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Now, according to a recent research paper which was published in United States of America, the growing problem of global warming and climate change has contributed to the increase in the income inequality across the countries of the world, wherein the report has highlighted that because of the global warming, the developing countries have continued to remain poor. On the other hand, the developed countries have continued to become richer. Now, for instance, the report has highlighted that between 1961 to 2010, India had to face a loss of 30% of the GDP because of the climate change. In other words, in the absence of climate change or the global warming, India's GDP would have been 30% higher. Alternatively, if you look at a developed country such as Norway, because of the climate change, its per capita income has increased by almost 34%. Now, in order to address the problem of global warming and climate change, countries across the world have taken a number of initiatives. For instance, under the UNFCCC mechanism, the countries have committed themselves to the Paris Agreement. However, this particular article here has highlighted that the countries across the world as such are not really interested in addressing the problem of climate change. Rather than addressing the problem, they are actually accentuating or increasing the ecological crisis. In this regard, this article mainly focuses on the fact that there is growing nexus among the various elites such as the government, corporate entities and the oil companies, which is in turn leading to the increase in the ecological crisis, and because of such a nexus, the planet Earth as such is heading towards an emergency. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand as to what kind of nexus exists between the government, corporates and the oil companies, and how such a nexus is actually increasing the present ecological crisis. Now coming to how the government-corporate nexus is actually accentuating the ecological crisis. First and foremost, the fossil fuels have been responsible for the increase in the concentration of the carbon dioxide. Hence, in order to arrest the problem of the global warming, there is need to reduce the consumption of the fossil fuels. However, if you reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, it would adversely affect the profit margin of oil companies. That is the reason the oil companies have formed a nexus with the government, wherein the oil companies have been funding the governments across the world and the governments in turn have been increasing the subsidy on the fossil fuels. For example, according to a recent study conducted by IMF, the subsidies on the fossil fuel have increased from $4.7 trillion in the year 2015 to $5.2 trillion in the year 2017. So rather than taking steps to reduce the consumption of fossil fuel by reducing the subsidies, the governments across the world have been increasing the subsidies on the fossil fuels mainly in order to benefit the oil companies, and this is in turn accentuating the ecological crisis. The second aspect of the government corporate nexus can be seen in the melting of the Arctic region. As you all must be aware, the Arctic region has been melting at an unprecedented pace due to the global warming. So rather than addressing the problems which have led to the melting of glaciers, the governments across the world are more concerned about the extraction of oil, gas and precious metals from the Arctic region. This once again shows that the governments have poorly responded to the present crisis in the Arctic region, and more importantly, it shows that the governments and corporate entities are more driven by the commercial motives rather than protecting the environment. The third aspect of the government corporate nexus has been explained in the article through a case study of Mozambique. Now, Mozambique is a country which is very rich in the liquid natural gas, and the extraction of this liquid natural gas is presently undertaken by the foreign companies. So, what has happened here is that most of the foreign companies have taken loans based upon the guarantee given by the Mozambique government. So recently, the Mozambique government defaulted on the loan repayment, and this in turn led to the economic crisis. Apart from that, the unsustainable mining of the liquid natural gas by the foreign companies has in turn led to the ecological destruction in Mozambique. So this particular case study highlights the fact that it is the foreign companies who have got immensely benefited from the extraction of the liquid natural gas. However, the impact of the ecological destruction is faced by the local population in Mozambique. Apart from that, this particular case study also highlights that it is the developed countries and the corporate entities who are responsible for the growing ecological destruction. However, the companies and the developed economies are not facing any kind of penalty. Rather, the penalty is falling on the poorer countries such as the Mozambique. Now, looking at these aspects of the article, we can come to a conclusion that both the governments as well as corporate entities have poorly responded to the planet emergency. In this regard, this article highlights that there is a need for people-led movements in order to put pressure on the governments and the companies so as to take suitable actions to combat the global warming. Now, in order to highlight as to how the people-led movements can actually put pressure on the governments, it has given certain case studies. For example, it has given the example of a movement known as the School Strike for Climate. Now, this particular movement has been started by a 15-year school-going girl known as Greta Thunberg in Sweden, wherein this movement seeks to organize the school children in order to put pressure on the governments so as to take suitable action to combat the climate change problem. Now, the success of this particular movement can be gauged from the fact that this movement started on a very small scale. However, over a period of time, it has come to acquire a global character. The second example of a people-led movement putting pressure on the government is that of the Extinction Rebellion in United Kingdom. As part of the Extinction Rebellion, people have come together and have started putting pressure on the government in the form of the civil disobedience movement. Now, this particular civil disobedience movement is along the Gandhian lines. Now, both these groups, that is, the School Strike for Climate as well as the Extinction Rebellion, have been putting pressure on the governments in order to become carbon neutral and reduce the carbon emissions. And to a certain extent, both these groups have been successful, which is evident in the fact that the British Parliament became the first parliament in the world to declare the climate emergency. So, because of the constant pressure exerted by the Extinction Rebellion, the British Parliament has now decided to reduce the carbon emissions and become carbon neutral. Now, there are mainly two problems with respect to this particular declaration. Firstly, the word climate emergency has not been clearly defined by the British Parliament. Secondly, it is not legally binding on the British government to reduce the carbon emissions. Nevertheless, one has to acknowledge the efforts of the Extinction Rebellion in putting pressure on the British Parliament to declare such an emergency. Hence, looking at the recent examples of the school strike for climate and the Extinction Rebellion, we can come to a conclusion that the people-led movements have been successful in order to put pressure on the governments so as to take suitable actions to combat the global warming. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 13. The title of the article is India finds the OECD index for the services trade faulty. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection current events of national importance as well as the Indian economy. Now this particular article highlights that India has raised certain concerns with respect to the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index which is published by the OECD. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us first understand about this particular index and then understand about the concerns raised by India with respect to this particular index. The Services Trade Restrictiveness Index is published by the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development. So the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, as the name suggests, provides information on the barriers to the trade with respect to services. Now if one looks at the service sector as such contributes around 2/3 of the global GDP. And in the recent times, due to the rapid growth of information and communication technology, the trade in services across the world has increased. However, it has been found out that some of the countries across the world have been erecting barriers with respect to the trade in services. Now, for example, some of the countries may prohibit the foreign investment in the service-based companies. For example, some of the countries may have restricted the FDI into some of the service sectors such as the banking, insurance, legal services and so on. Hence, in order to promote the international trade in services, we need to identify the barriers to the trade in services. And this is precisely what the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index does. So this particular index basically highlights the negative impact of the restrictive trade policies on the countries. That is to say, it highlights that by restricting the trade in services, the countries are adversely affecting their economy. Hence, in this regard, this index also provides for the policy inputs in order to facilitate a greater amount of trade with respect to services. So the idea here is that all the countries across the world should follow the global benchmark with respect to the facilitation of the international trade in services. With respect to coverage of this particular report, it is to be noted that this particular report is not only applicable to the OECD countries, it is also applicable to the non-OECD countries as well, including India. Overall, it measures the trade restrictiveness in 45 economies across the world. And in order to interpret this particular index value, the value of STRI is always between 0 to 1, wherein 0 would denote the least restrictive trade practices, whereas 1 would denote the most restrictive trade practices. Now, with respect to the Indian economy, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index has highlighted that India is most restrictive with respect to the entry of the foreign companies. That means to say, the report has highlighted that Indian economy as such does not facilitate the entry of foreign companies in the service-based sector. Now, this particular aspect of the report has been rejected by India, and accordingly, India has come up with the counter arguments. Apart from that, India has also highlighted that the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index is actually faulty since it does not take into account the various policy measures put in by the Indian economy in order to facilitate the international trade in services. Now, with respect to India's counter arguments, India has argued that it is the service sector in the Indian economy which has been able to attract the largest amount of FDI since its liberalization in the year 1991. Apart from that, India has also argued that the Indian government has liberalized various FDI norms with respect to the entry of foreign companies in the service-based sector. For example, with respect to the insurance sector, the Indian government has increased the FDI limit from 26% to 49%. Similarly, the Indian economy allows for 74% of FDI in the private sector banks. Similarly, if one looks at the FDI limit in the aviation sector, it has been progressively been increased to 100%. Now, the government of India believes that in spite of various policy measures undertaken in order to facilitate the international trade in services, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index has failed to capture these policy measures, and accordingly, the government of India has highlighted that the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index is actually faulty. Now, these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 9. The title of the article is Election Petition. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Indian Polity. Now, this particular article here basically talks about the various aspects related to the election petition. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we'll understand various facets related to the election petition, such as what exactly is the election petition, who hears the petition related to the elections, and under what grounds can the elections be declared as void. Let us start analyzing these aspects of the article one by one. The election petition is basically a case which is filed before a court of law, and such a case challenges the election of a candidate in a parliamentary, assembly, or a election to the Panchayati Raj institutions or the urban local bodies. Now, such an election petition can be filed on a number of grounds. Firstly, the election petition can be filed if the winning candidate was not qualified to fight the election or if he is not qualified to fill the particular seat. For example, in case of parliamentary elections, some of the seats are reserved exclusively only for the SCs and STs, which means to say only those people who belong to the category of SC or ST can contest election in that particular constituency. However, if a person belonging to the general category contests and fights the election under such circumstances, an election petition can be filed. This is because the person was not qualified to fight the election for that particular constituency. Secondly, the election petition can also be filed on the grounds that the winning candidate was involved in corrupt practices. Now, with respect to definition of corrupt practices, it has been defined under the Representation of People's Act, wherein the corrupt practices essentially refers to the undue influence of the voters through the use of money or muscle power. It also involves asking the voters to either vote or refrain from voting on the basis of the grounds of religion, race, caste, etc. So the appeal by the candidate to the voters to vote on the grounds of religion, race, caste or language is also treated as a corrupt practices under the Representation of the People's Act. Thirdly, the election petition can be filed on the grounds that the nomination papers were not properly accepted. Now, for example, if a candidate is filing for the nomination, he is compulsorily required to disclose his assets and liabilities properly. So, if a particular candidate fails to disclose his true assets under such circumstances, the election petition can be filed. And fourthly, the election petition can also be filed on the grounds of the non-compliance by the winning candidate with the provisions of the Constitution or the Representation of People's Act or any kind of rules and orders which are made under the Representation of the People's Act. Now, with respect to where the election petition can be filed, it is to be noted that the election petition can be filed only in the High Court of the particular state in which the election is conducted. And what is important to be noted here is that only the High Courts have the original jurisdiction to decide on the election petition. Now, the original jurisdiction here essentially means that the people have the right to approach the High Courts directly and not necessarily through an appeal. And such an election petition can be filed either by any candidate or an elector. However, the limitation here is that such an election petition has to be compulsorily filed within 45 days from the date of the declaration of results. Now, with respect to timeline for the disposal of election petition, the Representation of People's Act recommends that the trial for the election petition has to be concluded within 6 months. And lastly, it is to be noted that there is a provision to appeal before the Supreme Court against the order of the High Court. So, with respect to the jurisdiction of the High Courts or the election petition, the High Courts enjoy only the original jurisdiction, and they do not enjoy the exclusive jurisdiction. This is because the Supreme Court of India has been empowered to hear the appeals against the High Court. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 7. The title of the article is Quick and Cheap Diagnostic Test for Haemophilia A. This article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection General Science. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because the Indian Council for Medical Research has recently developed a new point of care diagnostic test for the bleeding disorders such as the Haemophilia A and the von Willebrand disease. The point of care diagnostic test essentially refers to the testing which is done outside the laboratories at the place where the patient is situated. Now, one of the main advantage of the point of care diagnostic test or the laboratory test is that it gives faster results, and because of which the doctors can take immediate action. Now, the significance of the development of this diagnostic test lies in the fact that this is the world's first point of care diagnostic test for the bleeding disorders. Apart from that, if one looks at the working cost of these diagnostic tests, it is less than rupees 50 as compared to the present cost of around rupees 4,000 to 10,000. So the development of this particular test would significantly cut down the diagnostic test for the bleeding disorders. Now, with respect to how this point of care diagnostic test actually works, it is not that important. However, one needs to know certain basic aspects related to hemophilia and the von Willebrand disease. Hemophilia is actually an inherited medical disorder. That is, it is a genetic disorder that reduces the ability of the blood to clot, and this is mainly caused due to the absence of the clotting factor. So depending upon the absence of the clotting factor, there are mainly two types of hemophilia, these being hemophilia A and the hemophilia B. Now the hemophilia A is mainly caused due to the reduced level of the clotting factor 8, whereas the hemophilia B is caused due to the reduced level of clotting factor 9. And with respect to causes of the hemophilia, it is mainly caused due to the defect in the X chromosome. Further, you all must be aware that females have two X chromosomes, whereas males have X and Y chromosomes. So because of the genetics involved in the way the sex of the child is determined, men are considered to be more vulnerable than the women with respect to hemophilia. Let us understand this by an example. The defective X chromosome here has been highlighted in the red color, whereas the normal X chromosome has been highlighted in black color. So in case of females, if one of the X chromosome is defective and if the other X chromosome is normal, under such circumstances, the normal X chromosome would be able to compensate the defective X chromosome. Now in this particular case, the female here would be a carrier of hemophilia, but she would not be affected by hemophilia. The female would be affected by hemophilia only when both her X chromosomes are defective. The males are considered to be more vulnerable than women with respect to hemophilia because if the males have defective X chromosome, then unlike in case of females where there is a normal X chromosome which can compensate the defective X chromosome, such a chromosome is absent in case of males. That is why males are considered to be more vulnerable to hemophilia than women. Now coming to the differences between hemophilia and von Willebrand disease. Now even though hemophilia and von Willebrand disease are bleeding disorders, the von Willebrand disease is mainly caused due to the genetic change on the chromosome 12. Whereas as discussed before, hemophilia is mainly caused due to the defect in the X chromosome. And unlike hemophilia, which is likely to affect men more than the women, The von Willebrand disease affects males and females equally. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Now based upon our discussion, these 4 questions shall be your prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We shall be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. The first question here is, which among the following categories of goods are covered under the Index of Industrial Production? Now in order to remember the different categories of goods which are covered under the IIP, you can remember this particular acronym IIP-CCC, wherein these components would stand for the intermediate goods, infrastructure goods, primary goods, capital goods, consumer durables and consumer non-durables. So if you look at the options which are given here, we can easily rule out the basic goods. And accordingly, the answer to this particular question shall be C, that is 1, 2 and 4. Now coming to the second question, the question here is, consider the following statements related to the employment elasticity. The first statement here is, it refers to the percentage change in the employment with 1% growth in the GDP. As discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, low employment elasticity shows higher job creation in the economy. Now this particular statement is wrong. This is because the low employment elasticity would show a low level of job creation. So looking at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is A. Now coming to the third question, the question here is, which among the following international organizations publishes the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index? And as discussed, the answer to this particular question is OECD. Now coming to the fourth question, the question here is, consider the following statements related to the election petition. The first statement here is, the High Courts have exclusive as well as the original jurisdiction to hear the election petition. Now this statement here is wrong. This is because the High Courts have only the original jurisdiction and they do not have the exclusive jurisdiction, since the Supreme Court can hear the appeals against the High Courts. The second statement reads as, the election petition can be filed by either the candidate or an elector. And as we have discussed, the second statement here is correct. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 2 only. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Let us now look at the question for the day.